A very special welcome also to those who are joining us online from afar. My name is Dr Dmytro. I'm one of the postdoctoral research fellows here at the school, specifically affiliated with the Alfred Landecker Programme, which is concerned about the position of minorities, particularly in Europe. For tonight, I'm very delighted to introduce you this event on the future of religious and ethnic diversity in Ukraine. And we have a fantastic panel lined up with Dmytro Vovk, who is Professor of Law and Religion at one of the universities in Kharkiv in Ukraine and currently visiting professor at Cardozo Law School in New York. We have Maya Tudor, who is Associate Professor of Politics here at the School of Government, specializing in nationalism and forms of national identity and nationalism. And then we have Ms. Lisa Reichenetz, who is a research assistant here at the school and who has been working on ethnic diversity in Ukraine. Sadly, this evening we aren't able to have Volodymyr Kulik and Olga Onuk due to the outings, the power outings in Kiev. This is a significant challenge. Volodymyr has said that he would Zoom in if he is able, but he might come in and out as he is able to. Very sad, of course, to miss them, but we're also happy to have the panel here, and I think there is lots of space for conversation. And at the end of our roundtable part, we'll certainly bring you in with the questions that you might have, so feel free to contribute to that. So let me start with some general introduction. So at the start of this war, there was mentioned briefly that this might be about the idea of the Russian world. So the idea that the Russian world extends into Belarus, into Ukraine, and that there's some sort of relationship, as it were, between the peoples of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Now, this is a language that was used briefly by Putin himself, but has been partially developed in the Russian Orthodox Church, and Patriarch Kirill has been speaking about this. But of course, the question is, to what extent actually can we talk about this war in these sorts of religious terms of Holy Russia, of the Russian world? And is actually religion all that important to what is going on in the Russo-Ukrainian war? Or are there maybe other things we need to talk about? So I would like to start with that question to you, Dmytro, and see if you might help us understand a little bit of what exactly the role is of religion in this terrible conflict.
Thank you. That's an interesting question because for sure we see that Putin uses this spiritual argumentation. For example, he compared Crimea to Temple Mount for Jews and Muslims. So it's the same like for Russian Orthodox people as that one for Jews and Muslims. We see this doctrine of the Russian world developed by the Russian Orthodox Church, that there is a sort of spiritual unity of Russian-speaking people, so-called, and this is a very vague term, of Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarus, and it's all one territory, one space with political center in Moscow. But you see, the problem is that all political goals that the Russia perceive in this war, they exist much before the doctrine of the Russian world emerged, and this claims about spirituality, this conflict emerged because, for example, the annexation of Crimea was on the table of Russian-Ukrainian negotiations in 1991, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Russia and Ukraine negotiated the deal. Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Ukraine, he said literally that we will annex. If you won't accept our conditions, we will annex Crimea, we will annex Donbass, we will annex North Kazakhstan, and that's actually what they did after that. So in literature, you can find the distinction between a sort of central influence of religion and peripheral influence or role of religion. Central influence is when parties of the conflict have these religious goals, and peripheral when they have these religious identities and somehow use these religious identities to promote or to advance these secular goals. And I would say that the Russian-Ukraine war definitely demonstrates the second variant. So the goals of the conflict is completely secular, while especially from the Russian side, we see this appeals to religion in order to justify their aggressive war against Ukraine.
Thank you. Yeah, if I can just continue a little bit on this in this vein, like during this conflict, the impression that some of us might have developed is that there is a distinction between those who are pro-Russian on the one hand and those who are pro-Ukrainian. Now, is that a distinction that you say is reflective of the diversity that is in Ukraine? Is it a helpful distinction to make, or is this actually making us not see certain things that we do need to see?
I mean, the role of religion in this distinction of Russian or Ukrainian, or that distinction as it exists?
So I think speaking of, like, we think of Ukrainians as divided between those who are pro-Ukrainian, the Ukrainian state, and there's those who may or may not support the Russian state. The numbers of this actually are quite low. I think the numbers show that about 90% of the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine actually support the Ukrainian state. So this is really quite important figure just to have in the back of our minds. But then, what does this distinction tell us? Because there's so many different sort of diversities in Ukraine.
I would say that it's just a bit more complicated than just division, sort of abstract pro-Ukrainian and abstract pro-Russian, because Ukraine is very diverse, is the fact. We are diverse with respect to language, we are diverse with respect to historical memory, we are diverse with respect to political preferences. The war somehow influenced this diversity, and now the Ukrainian society looks more consolidated around this idea of defending Ukraine. But still, the country is very diverse if you compare the Western country, which is more religious, which is Ukrainian speaking, which is more traditional, which associate themselves with Europe and with the West. And if you see that in East, the situation is different. But I would say that it does not mean that eastern part or southern part of Ukraine, they are pro-Russian. And the word demonstrates itself, because I live in Kharkiv. Kharkiv is a very Russian-speaking city. It's a part of Russian culture, because many Russian writers actually wrote about Kharkiv, like Ivan Bunin or Anton Chekhov or Ilfy Petrov, the authors of the most popular Russian language novel of the 20th century, 12 Chairs. Kharkiv is a sort of place, one of the cities that mentioned in the story, but it doesn't mean, we have the theater of Russian drama, but it doesn't mean that Kharkiv is politically pro-Russian in the sense that they somehow welcome Russian aggression. And the war actually proves this, because the Kharkiv population is just consolidated around the idea not to have Russian military occupy the city.
Thank you for that. So we've also thought a little bit about ethnic diversity and linguistic diversity. So when we look at Ukraine, it's not necessarily the case that everyone speaks a similar language, like here in the UK. Like, even though you might speak Welsh or you might speak Gaelic, you all speak English. There is a different sort of diversity of languages, and language is also very much attached to regional identity. So it means that there are different identities at play, whilst there is also a conversation about what then is national identity, and how can it be supported, how can it be sustained. And I just wonder if it is worth thinking about that when we look at the invasion. So during the invasion, we have seen that people have rallied around the defense of the Ukrainian state, the defense of their home, of their good, of their families, but then have some distinctions perhaps become less important, if other differences become more important. Could you say something about that, perhaps?
I would say that yes. I mean, the war demonstrates that these distinctions, they are not so important to result in sort of split of the country. Because if you watch videos that actually Ukrainian military made on this war, you will see that it would be in Ukrainian language, Russian language. You know that Orthodox Christians of different denominations, they are in the military. We know that people from all regions of Ukraine now in the military, they all unfortunately dying in this goal to defend of Ukraine. And I think, I mean, the main lesson actually of this war, that Samuel Huntington was wrong, because in the Clash of Civilization, he wrote that Ukraine is a sort of example of the country on the border of civilization, and the main threat is that Ukraine can be split in two parts. While there is no threat, Huntington wrote, of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine due to these cultural links, religious links, and so on and so forth. And now, 20 years after that, we see that he was completely wrong. And this diversity probably has become the part of our identity. And Ukraine somehow managed living together, being different, being of different languages, of different religions, of different political preferences, of very specific historical memories, you said, in different regions of Ukraine, and we live together. This is the main lesson.
Yeah, really, really fascinating. I wonder, you know, one of the things that we've heard about is that some Russian-speaking communities have started to use the language of the Ukrainian language more intentionally, more explicitly. Is this perhaps an example of perhaps a difference that has become more significant, so the Russian speakers versus the Ukrainian speakers? Or would you say actually this isn't that important to either the conflict or to national identity? What is your estimation of that?
Well, I don't have any sociology to say how many Russian-speaking people switched to Ukrainian language, but I know personally some adult people who start speaking Ukrainian in order to emphasize their Ukrainian identity, and I assume there could be quite a significant amount of people. But I think the word just demonstrates that there is no correlation, and I would say even causation in most of situations. Maybe in some situations there is a causation, but in most situations there is no causation between Russian language and a sort of pro-Russian political stance. The most absolute majority of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, they are pro-Ukrainian, and this is, this is evident, which means that the idea that Russian language somehow contributes to this political stance, it's not so evident, because probably I would say Russian propaganda and the fact that many territories of Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine was affected by Russian propaganda contribute to this politically pro-Russian stance much more. The other thing that, of course, as you know Russian language, you can listen to this propaganda and you can accept these theses that the Russian propaganda promote. But again, it's a bit more difficult, because actually many people beyond these regions also speak Russian.
Thank you.
And now, if we move to the notions of nation and national identity in this context, so Dmytro, when Western scholars speak of nation, they often divide states between ethnic or civic nations. And how do these designations map onto social realities in Ukraine, do you think?
Well, the irony, it's ironically enough that the main thesis of the Russian propaganda that actually Ukrainians are Nazis, which means that Ukraine has been creating a sort of ethnic national project. And as I said, you simply can't develop such project in so diverse country. And of course, if we are talking about contemporary Ukrainian nation, this is a political nation. This is less has less to do with ethnic kind of orientations or belongings, and more with political belongings, because of this diversity. And for example, there are no this ethnic or integrated nationalist in Ukrainian parliament. That's funny enough, because we don't have any successful nationalist projects. We don't have national politicians using this nationalist rhetoric as successfully, being elected to the parliament. President Zelensky is far away from any sort of rhetoric of this kind. But of course, Ukrainian nationalists, both liberal nationalists and kind of integrated nationalists, they should be grateful to Vladimir Putin, because nobody did so much for having nothing Russian in Ukraine as Putin did. Because when this war is over, of course, there will be no Russian language in public space. There will be no Russian language in educational curricula. There will be no Russian theater. There will be no Russian literature. There will be no Russian newspapers. There will be nothing Russian. And can you imagine this even a year ago? No. Can you imagine this 10 years ago? It was just impossible. Nobody would, talk about this. And this is a sort of striking result of this war. Putin has already created much more consolidated Russian society, Ukrainian society, around the idea that we must defend our country.
Now a question for you, Maya, in this context as well. In such a diverse country, as we see on the example of Ukraine, what would be the ways to create national identity or to create a sense of belonging?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, as has already been said, probably nobody has done more to create a sense of national belonging, or perhaps more precisely, to change the sense of national belonging in important ways than Vladimir Putin. So threat is always a very important motivator of action. So I was a late addition to this panel because we had a couple of panelists step out, and I had just a couple of points that I think that follow up from that I wanted to make more generally. I think the first point that I wanted to make is not always an obvious one, and that's that nationalism, and by nationalism I mean a sense of national identity. And I know that not everyone has that same association with the word nationalism. So I don't think of nationalism and patriotism as different things, and neither do most scholars of nationalism. It's really crucial for any successful nation state in the long term. Nationalism, a sense of belonging to a nation state, powers most effective policies at the national level. So if all of you think about where you were during the lockdowns of the COVID era, probably what you think of from that time was your experience was conditioned by how effective the national policies in your state were. And those national policies were in almost every state powered by a leader who announced restrictions with a flag behind them and said, do your duty to your nation. So that's just a really clear example in recent times of how across space and time nationalism has powered the effectiveness of state policy. And there's some really excellent research showing that where nations were more unified and where there was less conflict over the national identity, COVID policies were on the whole more successfully implemented. So the first point I want to make is just nationalism is crucial for any state to be successful. And of course, that leads us to the question of thinking about how do we think about nationalism in the context of Ukraine? So the second of 3 points I wanted to make is that nationalism in Ukraine is changing in really important ways, and that's already been alluded to. But it was interestingly changing in really important ways even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I looked up just before coming down, there was a survey of Ukrainian national identity in 2007 and 2015. So notably right before the Crimea invasion. And it showed that the composition of ethnic versus classically civic identity. So do you think of having to be yourself or the Ukrainian national identity as having to be ethnically Ukrainian? And that has gone down in those 7 years by 17%. So it just shows you how much the war or the invasion of Crimea, which was, I think, much less catastrophic than the current invasion of Ukraine has been, already saw this really important jump, difference in how Ukrainians understood their own national identity. And we don't have very good data about this now, but if I'm going to go on the record in making a prediction, I'm going to predict that a Ukrainian national identity has even moved more strongly in a civic direction. That doesn't preclude a post-war Ukraine moving along the lines of abolishing or moving the kind of pillar of Russian identity and Russian language out of national curricula. But it's interesting to think that Ukrainian national identity has changed in important ways. And the third point I wanted to make is that the future of Ukrainian politics in post-war Ukraine, and there will be a post-war Ukraine, even if it's a decade from now, that the nature of that politics will be very much determined by the nature of how Ukrainians understand their own national identity during this period of time. And the rise in a kind of civic understanding of national identity So that one needn't, for example, have particular religious background, one needn't have a particular ethnic background to be a member of the Ukrainian nation. That will be a very important glue for the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian nation in the post-conflict period. So those are the kind of main points I wanted to make.
And thank you. And having this said, Dmytro, what do you think is most fundamental to Ukrainian national identity?
Well, as I said, it's probably this phenomenon of diversity. Yes, that we somehow manage this because this things that makes us different. I mean, in the East or in the West, they look like fundamental. For example, historical memory about the Second World War, because for the West is more like a tragedy, because Ukraine was on the part of being attacked by two totalitarian systems, Nazi system and communist system. For East of Ukraine, it's more a story of victory, yes, or having language, because language is very important for your identity, for your personal feeling. And after language, you have literature, after literature, you have art, after art, you have other culture, aspects of culture, and so on and so forth. So it's like fundamental issues for both for individuals and for society as a whole. And religious difference, because we have two Orthodox churches, and we know, and we also have a quite influential Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and this religious diversity also determines some differences between West and East, between Central Ukraine and again Western Ukraine, and so on and so forth. And nevertheless, we still can live in this situation. We still. And it's a big question, why? Because it looks like Ukraine, the post-Soviet Ukraine is much less ideology-driven than many other Eastern European societies. Think about Poland or think about Hungary, and it's a sort of double-edged sword, because when society is consolidated, it's much better in doing economic reforms, but at the same time, you can get something like contemporary Hungary as a result. And in Ukraine, we have this weak state, we have this diverse society, we have significant problems with institutions and with transition to liberal democracy. But at the same time, one of the most serious results of this post-Soviet Ukraine, it's a very strong civil society. We have flourishing religious communities. We have very influential NGOs, which are pushing reforms like judiciary, the rule of law, economic reforms, human rights. They pushing state forward in this reform. So, and I mean, and this is probably part of us. And if you remember, the most famous slogan of Maidan was "Freedom is our religion." I would say that, of course, there could be different explanations of this slogan, but there is something core in this idea in explaining Ukraine.
So it turns out that if we talk about national identity, it's just not one ethnicity or like one language or one religion that is fundamental to it, but the diversity of these itself.
Yes, and as I said, a war sort of put aside some of these diversities, but it doesn't mean that they were eliminated. And of course, this debates around language, around historical memory, around politics, they will be back after the war is over. And of course, after the war is over, President Zelensky would probably be under criticism because of his cultural or language or religious preferences. But as I said, we managed to live with that.
Speaking about religion, given that you are a scholar of law and religion, it's maybe worth spending some more time on what these relationships are between the churches and the state in Ukraine. You've already mentioned there's two Orthodox churches, so we're talking about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which formerly was part of the Moscow Patriarchate, and then there is the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is the autocephalous church, which means they've got a measure of autonomy and are attached more or less to the territory of Ukraine. And so there's two churches, Orthodox churches, that historically have this idea of symphonia, so the idea that you collaborate to some extent with the state. But of course, in Ukraine, there are divisions here, and it doesn't seem to be so obvious that either of these churches could even try to establish that sort of relationship. How do you see that develop? What do you think of Zelensky's position in all of this? How he does manage the relationships between those churches? I think that this is probably worth thinking about, especially because the Moscow Patriarchate Church has financial ties, has religious ties to Moscow, to the Patriarch of Moscow. So there obviously could be a sort of geopolitical question attached to how this relationship develops. What is your perspective on this?
Well, I doubt that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate has financial ties, but they do have religious and political ties, no doubt. The Ukrainian case is very specific, both among post-Soviet states and among Orthodox majority states. Because in contrast to most of Orthodox majority states, we have a religion of majority, which is Christian Orthodoxy, but we don't have a church of majority. Because the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is split into two churches, and none of them is the church of majority, and it's kind of permanent competition. And this split is a big tragedy for the Orthodox Church, but of course, it's quite a significant factor of religious pluralism, because when Orthodox churches are competing, they don't have enough capacity to collaborate with the state and to, let me put it quite straightly, to oppress religious minorities. And that's why Ukraine is the country with the biggest Catholic Church of Eastern Rite, which is Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. That's why Ukraine is the country with the biggest Baptist community. That's why Ukraine is the country, as I think with the biggest so-called Mormon community, although it's still quite tiny minority. So we have this sort of religious renaissance. And the second point is that in contrast to most of post-Soviet states, Ukrainian legal framework, religious legal framework, is very liberal. We don't have mandatory registration of religious organizations, which most of the post-Soviet states had, I think all, except members of the European Union. We don't have so-called anti-extremist legislation targeting specifically religious communities, as for example, Russia has or Central Asian countries has, and it's a very powerful tool because you can declare any religious community extremist, just ban them, as Russia did with Jehovah's Witnesses. And that's why we don't have significant restrictions on missionary activities and so on. And that's why religious market in Ukraine is much more competitive than in most Orthodox countries. Think about Russia, Georgia, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on and so forth. And this again contributes to this strong civil society, contributes to the situation when religious minorities are very visible, when they have their own political sponsors, when they do their own humanitarian work, and when they obviously contribute to social well-being. With respect to Zelensky, it's very interesting because all Ukrainian presidents, because of political reasons or because of religious reasons or because of both, sort of have had their own partners in the religious communities, either one Orthodox church, another Orthodox church. Zelensky looks like a person with no religious background at all, with no religious experience. He's a very secular, and he somehow tries to maintain this religious neutrality. And that's why his policies, again, with respect to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate, is quite different from policies of President Poroshenko, because Poroshenko affiliated himself with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and did a lot in order to get autocephaly. For the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, I would say that his contribution, the contribution of the Ukrainian government, was crucial in order to get autocephaly from Patriarch Bartholomew. While during Zelensky presidency, even now, when the affiliation with Moscow is a significant problem, we see quite a different approach, because when the war started, the government started imposing sanctions on business actors, political actors, pro-Russian politicians, media actors, and so on. And it looked like Moscow Patriarchate will be the next one in this list. But as we see, as for now, because there are many scandals and the situation is changing all the time, many scandals around Moscow Patriarchate, but still we see that the government chose in favor of different approach. First of all, they kind of intensified investigations and prosecutions against Moscow Patriarchate's clerics allegedly involved in collaboration with Russia. And second point, the government is sort of tries to nudge the Moscow Patriarchate to be sort of more Ukrainian church or pro-Ukrainian church to conduct services in Ukrainian language, to be more open for the dialogue with the other Orthodox Church and with other religious communities in Ukraine. But at least for now, do not try to impose a kind of whole ban on the Moscow Patriarchate. And this is one of aspects of probably Zelensky's personal attitude to religion, because he's very skeptical to religion. As I said, he has no religious experience, and probably think that this sort of step back from religious competition for the Ukrainian state is kind of better option.
Maya, I wonder if you have some thoughts on this. And it seems a very strategic choice of Zelensky to not oppress the church that is associated with the Moscow Patriarchate as a whole. But there certainly is a crackdown on those who are individually perhaps responsible for some collaboration with Russia. Do you think this is a wise strategy to kind of keep religion sort of out of the story of national identity and try to kind of de-emphasize it as part of this conflict?
Well, I'm no Ukraine expert, but in general, the ability of national leaders, when national leaders marry a particular religious or ethnic identity to the very definition of the nation, that has real downstream consequences for the nature of politics. So in particular, when you define belonging to a nation through an ethnic, religious, racial identity, what tends to end up happening is that those in subsequent political moments, there are always incentives for political entrepreneurs to say, essentially scapegoat political minorities because they're not legitimately first-class citizens. So in a sense, I think it's a strategic, whether or not it's a strategic choice, I think it's a wise choice in the sense of not essentially closely identifying the Ukrainian national identity with a particular religious institution, a particular religious identity, and it allows the kind of e pluribus unum flavor of national identity that I think has been a strong strand since the 19th century in Ukraine to continue to be part of Ukraine's modern national identity.
I would add, if I may, that probably Zelensky thinks that religious element of Ukrainian identity is not so important. Because first, if you ask an average Ukrainian, who are you? He would probably say something about Ukrainian citizenship. He would probably think that he lives in a certain region. And only after that, religion will come. Yes, so it's not a sort of first indicator that most of Ukrainians will recall talking about themselves. And second point, that we don't really have any reliable sociology that somehow religious affiliation determines political preferences of Ukrainians. Because the phenomenon of the split in Orthodox Church, that actually these are still the same Orthodox Christian Orthodoxy. They have the same liturgy, they have the same kind of saints, they have the same religious texts, they have the same tradition, and so on and so forth. So the main difference between them is political, while the Orthodox Church is sort of attached to the Ukrainian state, Orthodox Church of Ukraine attached to the Ukrainian statehood, and it actively supports the Ukrainian statehood. The Moscow Patriarchate is somehow distanced from the Ukrainian statehood because of these links with the Moscow Patriarchate, and they emphasized before the war. They emphasized that sort of we are the church for Ukrainian people, not for Ukrainian state, and all this sort of stuff. Ethno-religious sort of threat. We tried to emphasize that we are not, ill with this ethno-religious. But we do kind of see that in many situations, political preferences can determine religious identification because of these religious similarities. People, especially those who are not churchgoers, they prefer to be associated or to be affiliated with one church or another based on their political preferences, which means that probably religion is important in Ukraine. I don't want to, to somehow underestimate the importance of religion in many aspects, especially in humanitarian aspect and so on. But probably in political preferences, it not so important, and that's why probably Zelensky think that it's not a kind of big deal, and we don't need to go into inter-Orthodox competition in order to have this threat somehow addressed.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything to that, Maya?
Yeah, we should take some questions.
I think we should. Yeah. So let's go to the room. We've got some questions in the chat already. So if you're online and you would like to ask some questions, please feed them to the chat, and then we will make a selection of the questions that we can bring into this conversation. But I wonder if in the meantime, there are some questions also here in the room. You've been listening to some reflections on religious and to some extent ethnic diversity in Ukraine, and you might have your own questions about where is this all leading? Yes, please.
Expert on Ukrainian literature or indeed Russian literature, but could you amplify a little bit more when you say there'll be no Russian in schools, there'll be no Russian literature? How will that really play out, given that in my ignorance, I imagine that much of the great Ukrainian literature is written in Russian?
You know, there is a big debate, you probably know about this in Ukraine, whether Ukrainian literature can be written in Russian, whether literature written in Russian is Ukrainian, because I can remind at least just one surname among big writers, which is Nikolai Gogol, who is definitely famous for his Russian written novels and Dead South and all this stuff, but also he is sort of considered to be Ukrainian writer because of his identity and because of Вечера на хуторі близ Диканьки, if you know what I mean, and so on. But at least beyond Gogol, Ukrainian literature is something written, in my view, as I understand it, is written in Ukrainian. And because even if we're talking about, for example, the phenomenon of Odessa literature, or the Odessa writers like Ilfe, Petrov, Bagritsky, Kataev, and so on, they are thought as Russian, part of Russian literature. Olesha, they're thought as a part of Russian literature, not a part of Ukrainian literature, because they live in Russia, because Moscow or somewhere, because they wrote Russian, and so on. And what I mean, there will be no Russian literature, it's very kind of technical, because we see that, first of all, many parents now, they are radically against having Russian literature in school curricula. We had some announcements from the Ministry of Education that we will revise school curricula in order to have less Russian literature. For example, not to have someone like Bulgakov, who is has very explicit anti-Ukrainian stance, in order to have more Central European or Eastern European writers like Czeslaw Miłosz, for example, or someone like him. And so that will be not a sort of big debate about the role of Russian literature. It will be just technically erased from school curricula. And emotionally, you know, somehow I can understand that, because let me tell you my personal story. Yeah, I spent first 5 days in Kharkiv with my family when the Russians start shelling the city. And we relocated to a kind of different neighborhood, which was more safer, and but we still had to go to shelter. And in the shelter, my older daughter, who is 11, she entertained my younger daughter, who is 2.5, by reading funny verses of Samuel Marshak, you know, this the famous Soviet and Russian poet and translator. And I caught myself on the kind of absurd sort that my Russian-speaking kids had to hide in a shelter and read Russian-speaking poetry because Putin decided to protect Russian-speaking people by destroying Russian-speaking cities. And I would say that this is the feeling that many people in Eastern Ukraine now have. And that's why there could be some sort of idiosyncrasy or radical, kind of way that we do not accept it as a part of our education, as a part of our cultural space. I don't know whether it's good or bad from cultural or literature point of view. I just, want to emphasize that this is a sort of thing that is being discussed in Ukrainian society. And you might know that, for example, in 2014, there was a several cases when Lenin monuments were destroyed. But now it's a kind of the second wave when Pushkin monuments destroyed. And it's much more kind of significant story, because in some way you can make like Pushkin in Russian literature, they're just equal. Yeah, because it's like Shakespeare for Russian speaking people. So this is in that way. So because of this political situation, because of war, because of this trauma that many Russian speaking people has, I know that many parents, they just don't want to have it in school curriculum.
I just really quickly wanted to add to this point that this is not a phenomenon that, again, is particular to Ukraine. Moments of military and geopolitical conflict you tend to see a kind of demonization of the broader culture of the other, and it was happened in this country as well earlier this year when I believe it was Tchaikovsky, or it was a Russian composer who was taken off the Royal Philharmonic playlist because of the association with Russia. We're living right now, we're the World Cup is happening, and there's very good research that shows that subnational identities that you belong to, which would of course not include the United Kingdom because it has multiple teams playing at the subnational level, but that your affiliation to subnational identities rises or declines rather during the time the World Cup is played. Why? Because the salience of your national identity relative to your subnational identities rises because you identify with the thing that is going on geopolitically, namely the World Cup team, often representing the sovereign nation state, is playing. So it's a very natural phenomenon in social and human psychology, and it of course is that much more intense when it's your family is being forced to evacuate to a bomb shelter.
Thank you. Yeah. My question relates to the micro ethnicities in Ukraine, and I'm talking in this case in the context of how, especially the global South, has viewed what has happened in Ukraine and how the response of Ukraine to Ukrainian nationals outside has been calibrated. So, for example, the issue, even though they are very minorities, the discrimination that Afro-Ukrainians and Romas and refugees who had settled in Ukraine and were kind of in between getting either citizenship or asylum in Ukraine, suddenly were in Europe and became non-Ukrainians when they became refugees. And the impression of this in the global South has been very much that not only is Europe very discriminatory in their attitude, but also that within Ukraine itself, who are these people? So my question is maybe a little bit unfair. In the context of Ukraine wanting to be part of the EU, which sees itself as a multi-ethnic, multicultural, embracing set of countries, theoretically, how do Ukrainians themselves, and maybe it's an unfair question because you're in the middle of a war, but in the new reimagination of the new Ukraine, where do these other non-Russian, non-Slavic, but communities who live and call themselves Ukraine and have come to be Ukrainian because they're refugees, where do they sit? Is there an idea of Ukraine reimagining itself into the future as being a multicultural, open, diverse, I mean, really diverse society? Thank you.
You know, I'm not an advocate of the Ukrainian state, but I would say that I'm not really agree with this perspective because of one reason. I'm not sure that there was beyond Russian propaganda, there were so many cases when some asylums, they didn't get something because of one simple reason. Before the war, there were 2,500 refugees in Ukraine. 2,500 for 40 million country. So it's just not so many people, actually. And all those cases that Russia propaganda shows and reiterates all the time were more or less about refugees and more about students from this global south that studied in Ukraine. And we can talk about this, why it happened. I would say that for the global south, for India, for example, or for Arabian countries, what was more important that there was a kind of evident difference how Europe accepted or has accepted Ukrainian refugees, and how Europe has accepted, in particular the United Kingdom, has accepted, for example, Syrian refugees. And that fact that there was some difference was sort of a big deal for the global south. But I would say that it's more a discourse that should be done here at the European Union or here at the United Kingdom rather than in Ukraine. It's the first point. The second point, I would say that I can imagine quite, well, not significant number, but a few states within the European Union, which would be quite negative if their citizens do not speak their national languages. But this is the reality of Ukraine. When some Hungarian minorities, they don't speak either Russian or Ukrainian because they prefer to speak Hungarian. This is, I can imagine a couple of European Union states where the issue of national religion or national church would be much a bigger deal for their government, and the intervention into religious issues would be much more serious. Think about Poland. I can imagine some European states where far right parties are an element or are represented in the parliament. Think about Italy, think about Hungary, think about some other countries. But this is not the case for Ukraine. This is not the case for Ukraine with respect to this interference in religious issues. I would say that religious freedom in Ukraine is much well protected than in most, I emphasize, in most Eastern European members of the European Union. So in this situation, I would not call Ukrainian diversity as a sort of fake diversity. It's real diversity. And in this sense, I don't really think that we have any problems with joining the European Union, although I'm quite skeptical that it would happen in the near future. What we do have is significant problems, for example, with the rule of law. And that's why we need sort of to do quite significant work in order to reform judicial system, in order to reform, for example, constitutional system, and so on and so forth. We do have some problems with institutions because Ukrainian institutions are quite weak. I mean, governmental institutions, and so on and so forth. So there are some real problems, but I wouldn't say that's a problem with diversity.
I wonder if I could come in here just briefly. I spent some time in Hungary over the past month on field work, and I was speaking with some people who were specializing in migration, and they were telling me something about how some of the Hungarian community in Ukraine had decided to move over into Hungary during the early days of the war. But when this influx from Ukraine happened, this obviously wasn't limited to the ethnic Hungarians. There was also a significant group of Roma that came along, and there was a marked difference even within Hungary in how these two groups were received. And I've heard things like Roma people being told, why do you not go back? It's okay in Ukraine, right? It's okay in your part of Ukraine. And that is obviously a discourse that is inherent in how Hungary has treated migration also since 2015. But I think this is an issue that we see in Hungary, but perhaps also in the wider region, that there are some questions about how the Roma population is treated, where the Roma population is being structurally disadvantaged. And I think at a time such as a war kind of amplifies this. It shows even more how significant the deprivation is at a point where these communities are denied things like housing, access to jobs, and basically are told to go back to a war zone. So I found that quite concerning. Obviously, that doesn't answer your question about Ukraine as such, but I think it is good to, I think, see this from the perspective of the wider region as well. I wonder if there is any other questions in the room. I'm aware that we're coming up to the last 5 minutes of our session. There was one question certainly online, and this was a question about the Russian-speaking population and their receptiveness to Russian propaganda. I wonder if you're able to say a few words about that and perhaps make a distinction between the territories that are under the control of the Ukrainian government and those that aren't at the moment. So I wonder if that could be our final question then.
Well, of course, the territories then which are under the Russian control, they are in significant pressure of the Russian propaganda because it's the only source of information that they have. And we can only think that we have had no reliable research of how, for example, identity in Donetsk and Lugansk or in Crimea has changed since 2014, but I presume that it has changed significantly. And when these territories is liberated and when they become a part of me, unfortunately, I should probably say if they become reintegrated to Ukraine, there would be a big issue of probably competing identities in that territories and the territories under the Ukrainian government control. But this is this specific situation. And we see that what Russia brings to all occupied territories is that they started this propaganda, they started suppression of religious minorities, they started oppression of all independent media, and so on and so forth. So this is a sort of their intentional politics, not to have all this stuff. Especially in religious field, for example, we know that they intentionally encourage social hatred toward religious minorities. This Russian proxies in Donetsk and Lugansk, they initiated so-called actions against sects. The word sect in Russian has a very negative connotation, something like cult in English, and it's a sort of politics, policies that they realize in that territory. While in Russian-speaking territories, in Ukraine, I mean, I wouldn't expect that it would be a problem of their somehow identity would need somehow be re-educated and so on and so forth. It will be kind of this ongoing process of discussion around this identity. Who are heroes of Ukraine? Who are Ukrainian writers? What is Ukrainian history? What's the goal, the kind of global goal of Ukraine? And this discussion will be contributed by both Russian-speaking Ukrainians and Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians. But I wouldn't say that these are two separate parties, because first of all, there is an internal structure. In both situations, there are some overlapping identities, because think about Kiev, who is predominantly Russian-speaking city. But he is so patriotic, especially after the war begins. He is so pro-Ukrainian that you would never even imagine.
Mm-hmm. So there's significant differences between the experience of those who've lived through the war in Ukraine, in the territories that are controlled by the Ukrainian state, by the territories that are under the control of Russia, and of course also those who have migrated temporarily or long-term to the European Union or to other areas. So there are so many moving parts, and I think when we come to the stage of a proper post-war conversation, these are all identities that somehow need perhaps not only just governing, but a lot of healing as well in a cultural sense, in a political sense, in economic sense. And I think this is something that is important for us to realize, that the conflict doesn't end when the weapons are silent, and that this is a long-term challenge to Ukraine and a long-term challenge, and that I hope that scholarship from outside Ukraine will come alongside Ukrainian scholars to think through these questions constructively. With that, I think I would like to thank you, Dmytro and Maya, and also Lisa for your contributions to this roundtable, and of course to questions and to your participation. So thank you very much. Have a good evening, and we close here. Thank you.